So hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this month's Crae webinar. My name is Laura Crane and I'm the Interim Director of the Centre for Research in Autism Education, or Crae. And we are based at UCL's Faculty of Education and Society at University College London in the UK. And at Crae, we conduct autism research, but importantly, we aim for all of that research to be on topics that matter to autistic people and their allies, and that genuinely make a difference to people's day-to-day lives. And we take a really participatory approach in all that we do, making sure that we involve the autistic and broader autism communities in our work at multiple levels. And at Crae, we also have a strong commitment to making sure that knowledge and information about autism is shared beyond academia, and that everyone can engage with both our work, but also that of other researchers and advocates in a really engaging and accessible way. And that's one of the reasons that we run our Crae webinar series. And at this point, I'd like to say a particular thank you to all of our funders, supporters and team members who make these events possible, and particularly to the Pears Foundation, who support our work at Crae and without whom these events wouldn't be possible. So that's a bit about us. And now I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Joris Lechêne. Joris is a trainer in anti-racism, bias and decoloniality, and also brings to this talk expertise from his autistic lived experience. And the Crae team first got to hear about Joris when our director, Anna Remington, attended some training that Joris delivered. And Anna came back and said just how incredible it was, and told us to make sure that we wrote down that we had to invite him to deliver one of our Crae webinars when the time comes. And we did. And I know that since Anna first mentioned Joris to us and he kindly accepted our invitation to speak, that he's gained a lot of fans within the team who've been saying how much they love his videos on Instagram and on TikTok. And as a result, I learned what TikTok was and I learned how to use it, and they really, really are brilliant. So if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you to take a look. And we're all really, really excited for the talk today, as I'm sure our audience are too. And if any of the members of the audience have questions that they'd like to pose, you can either put these in the Q&A, or if you prefer to post them anonymously, you can use a website called Slido, and the link to the Slido for those who want to use it should be going in the chat shortly. So thank you again, Joris, for delivering our Crae webinar this month, and we really look forward to your talk on autism and psychological colonialism. Over to you.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to start by introducing myself and what I do, but also what I don't do. So I am Joris Lechêne. I based my work as a trainer on my lived experiences. So I'm a trainer on anti-racism, privilege, bias, and decoloniality. And I'm also active on social media, where I draw parallels between the different power dynamics, the different forms of oppression, and I try to show how they all boil down to the same power dynamic between dominant group and dominated groups. So that's the kind of knowledge that I apply in my practice of sociology, but that I also draw from my own lived experience and my experiences of marginalization. I am a queer person, I am a Black person, and I am neurodivergent, both on the autistic spectrum and ADHD. So those experiences are the expertise that I bring into both my trainings and that I will be bringing to this webinar today. What I am not, however, is a researcher. I'm not an academic, and so my research or this webinar is not necessarily using the methodology that a lot of researchers would use, and I do not claim to have that methodology. However, if as a result of this webinar, assuming that a lot of people in the audience are researchers, if this can inspire you to do research, even if it's out of spite because you thoroughly disagree with what I'm saying or with some of the bold statements that I'll be making, then I invite you to investigate and maybe start some research in those directions. That would be a win for me, even if you do not agree with some of the statements that I'll be making in this webinar. So that's for who I am and who I'm not. And now I am going to start sharing my screen, and we will begin with this keynote. So today, well, initially I wanted to talk specifically about colonial mindset and how I could see parallels between the way autism is or has been approached and some of the ways that colonial mindset has influenced the perception of people of color or colonized people. But I have decided to broaden it up even more and talk more generally about decolonizing autism. So those two notions may seem completely unrelated. However, I will hopefully during this training, this session, show you how they are related. But before we go, as far as I could tell, I am the only, if not the only person presenting at Crae webinar series who's not a researcher or not an academic, at least. And if it would appear that I'm the first person of color presenting at the Crae webinar. And I do not think that it's a coincidence. Those two facts are correlated because there is a combination of systemic factors making it exceedingly unlikely to find autistic people of color doing research on autism. And those multiple factors are underrepresentation in academia of people of color that are combined with barriers to accessing diagnosis and identification for autistic people. So if good research on autism is the combination of academic methodology and lived experience, and this is also what Crae tries to do, then people of color face barriers to access on both sides. So both on the academic side and the lived experience identification side. So let's look at the underrepresentation in academia. We know that people of color, and more specifically Black people in the UK, are vastly underrepresented. So not only do they face barriers to enter the circles of academia and higher education and research, but once they are in there, they also face difficulties. For instance, they do not progress at the same rate. There's still a pay gap, a racial pay gap. And if we look at the intersection of, for instance, people of color and woman identity, we see that white BAME female are vastly underrepresented as well. And so within the BAME females, if we look at Black women professors in the UK, in 2020, out of about 23,000 professors in the UK, there were only 25 Black women. So, and Black people in general are also largely underrepresented. Women are largely underrepresented. So this is just to give you an idea of the underrepresentation of people of color, of Black people within academia, research, and higher education. So it was very likely that finding a person of color who would be in a position of being a researcher was going to be rare anyway. On top of that, if we add the identity of identifying as an autistic, people of color face multiple barriers as well to either identifying as an autistic person or even accessing diagnosis. So here there's been a research by autism.org.uk. Well, there hasn't been a research, but there was a survey trying to understand the specific challenges of people of color regarding their autistic criteria and in general also learning disabilities. So they listed a certain number of challenges that were specifically faced by people of color. First of all, the level of understanding of autism was lower within minority communities, which may have delayed diagnosis, and barriers to accessing support services. because of marginalizations. Parents talked about challenging understanding autism and knowing what services are available due to information only being available in English, for instance, because BAME people of color in the UK are more likely to be less fluent in English. Communication problems with professionals. So here we see that the identity and marginalized identity and ethnic minorities are compounded with struggles with the institution, and that also includes healthcare professionals. So that adds up to the situation that makes it more difficult to have access to diagnosis, help, accommodation. Awareness of and understanding of autism within the communities can also be either non-existent or be different from the Western understanding of autism, and we'll see more of that later. So that can be a barrier for people to identify that specific identity as autism, even though someone may be identified as different within their own cultural context. Autism might not be the label that is attached to it, depending on their cultures. Then therefore, if they are in the UK, they are less likely to seek for help for that specific diagnosis if they don't realize that this is what they would be called or considered as in this country. And there might be also a specific sets of stigma within those communities that are attached to autism or mental health in general. Marginalized populations may focus on surviving economically, and therefore there might be less room for considerations of mental health and neurotype, learning disabilities, and there might be some stigma attached to it. So that also represents a barrier to accessing autism identification and diagnosis. So there is a lack of research about the experience of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. And this means that it can be even harder for autistic people in the main community to get the support they need. And so as we've just seen, ethnic and racial identities have a huge impact on the autistic lived experience, at least in the West, and more specifically in the UK. Although there are no stats on autism and ethnicity in the UK, we can use the table that you see here about learning disability as an indication of how ethnicity might affect autism too. And here, this is a table of the median age of death of people with learning disability in the UK. And well, the numbers are grim for all categories and all ethnic identities, but we see that, for instance, for adults, female, it's 66 years for white females, and or in 2020, and only 42 years for male minority ethnic. So there is a huge gap here. It's already very, very sad and very, very worrying to see the difference of life expectancy or median age of death here. But on top of that, if we add ethnic minority into the equation, we see that there is an even bigger discrepancy. So to understand how ethnicity and race affects the experience of autism, we need to question and then contextualize our understanding of autism altogether. So this is what I am about to do with the rest of this webinar. And we will first look at Western centrism and the autism criteria. So if we look at both the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, which are the manuals that are, from my understanding, most commonly referred to describe and diagnose autism, I've had a look at the criteria, and I noticed certain particularities. So if we look at it, and here is the autistic criteria is the persistent deficit in social communications and social interactions across multiple contexts as manifested by the following. So as you see here, the highlighted terms, we talk about deficit, we talk about abnormal social approach, failure of normal, failure to respond to social interactions, deficit, behaviors used for social interaction. So it's all of those terms, they are rather not based on the severity of the impairments that might be experienced by the person, but rather on a notion of norm. What is the norm and what is outside of the norm? So those notions are highly subjective. Absence of interest, lack of facial expression, again, lack of, as opposed to what is the right amount of facial expression. So all of those, the diagnostic manuals claim to be based on the severity of impairment experienced by the subject in multiple areas. But if we examine those criteria through a sociology lens, we notice a heavy reliance on norms and conventions that have nothing to do with how the subject may experience their autism. This discrepancy is compounded by the lack of acknowledgement that those norms and conventions are based on white Western norms. And that posture is based on the erroneous belief that social norms are shared universally across cultures, traditions, and positionalities. History shows us what happens when we fail to acknowledge the subjectivity of our norms and practices, and that's what I call the colonial mindset. That posture is based on the erroneous belief that norms are shared universally across cultures, traditions, and positionalities. So I'll tell you more about the colonial mindset. And I have divided it in three main assumptions. What is invisible to the colonizer is non-existent. And as an example of that, we have, for instance, the belief for a very long time that that indigenous people from the Americas and also Aboriginal people did not practice agriculture. Why is that? Because the settler colonizers arrived in the Americas or in Australia and didn't see fields of wheat or corn. Therefore, they assumed, because they didn't see it, it was invisible to them, they just assumed that there was no agriculture. What we know now and understand better, and that they had simply a different way of managing their land, but that didn't mean that the land wasn't managed. The landscape was entirely artificial, human-made, but instead of, for instance, having fields and monoculture, they relied on different ways of farming and on managing the land. But the assumption here was that because we don't see something that we can recognize, we just assume that it does not exist. So that was colonial mindset. Invisible equals non-existent. Incomprehensible to the colonizer equals deficient. And here we have, for instance, how the social structures of the Aztec, the Incas, but also the many African empires that existed prior to the arrival of the white man and prior to colonization. There were structures, social structures with conventions and traditions and a system of hierarchy, but because that was different from what the Europeans were used to, and because it served the purpose of justifying the exploitation of indigenous and Black people, it was said and assumed that those structures were deficient, were not as efficient as the white European way of doing things, of organizing the space, society, relationships. So that was, again, an assumption. And lastly, what is different from the colonizer is inferior or wrong. And here I can give you the example of the gender identities, which many indigenous cultures and civilizations and Black civilizations did not rely on the binary of male, female. There were two spirits in North America and many other forms of what we would consider to be on the non-binary spectrum or the trans spectrum. But at the time, because it was different, it was assumed to be wrong, morally wrong, and inferior. So those are examples of how the colonial mindset affected or was perceived at the time of colonization. Now, what does it have to do with autism? I'm going to get there. So the colonial mindset's implicit assumptions, these assumptions exclusively center and validate the dominant group's perception. So here, the European settler colonist, and they served as the basis to the moral justification for colonization, slavery, and genocide. And the same mindset can also at times result in saviorism through supposed charity and self-proclaimed advocacy. For instance, bringing civilization to the savages, missionaries, and also the whole French colonial project, which was to bring literature and French language and school to Africa, and that was used as a justification. So we see here that the colonial mindset, even though it is a form of oppression, it can take the form of self-proclaimed advocacy, charity, and etc. So now, if we go back to autism, many of the traits, as we've seen with those extracts from the DSM-5 and ICD, many of the traits that supposedly define autism are based on their divergence from norms that are wrongly assumed to be universal. And what we consider appropriate ways of communicating, engaging, and expressing attention varies across cultures. And that is not taken into consideration in the autistic criteria. And here, hopefully, you begin to see the parallel that I'm trying to draw between a certain dominant group and another dominant group and their perception of what is different, what diverges from what they already know. So now, based again on the autistic criteria, some of the traits, the supposed traits of autism, are a deficiency in conversation skills, and namely interrupting in conversations. So here I've collected a few examples of articles on the internet talking about the urge or the necessity of teaching autistic people, forcing them to stop interrupting, because of course that is a big problem. How can they possibly communicate if they do not follow the convention of conversations? So how to stop kids from interrupting, pedantic speech, the tendency to interrupt frequently for Asperger's people. So all of those are the implied thing here is that if we do not follow a certain way of communicating, we have an impairment in communication, or we have a deficit in communication. What this fails to acknowledge, though, is that the art of conversation is really based on our cultural norms, and that those norms, again, are not universal. And here I give you the example of Japan. We see, for instance, with the concept of aisuchi, which is the conversational interjection that Japanese speakers use when speaking with one another. Aisuchi is primarily a way for the listener to communicate to the speaker that they are listening. So it is not considered rude or impolite to interrupt the person speaking, so long as it is to say some aisuchi. So we have examples of other cultures in which interjecting and actively participating in the conversation is considered as a form of showing attention. In our Western culture, interrupting or saying words or interjecting in a conversation is considered as not paying attention. Both are completely valid. What is important to know is that both notions are not universal. It highly depends on the culture. So when we have an autistic criteria that is based on the way we engage in a conversation, that does not acknowledge the cultural differences that may occur, then we take the risk to miss how autism may manifest in other cultures, and to misdiagnose autism from people of other cultures. So in any case, it is important to acknowledge that what we considered as certain traits are not universal, and they're based on a specific culture, which is the Western culture. Other example, after conversations, the case of the eye contact. It is considered as a typical autistic trait to struggle with eye contact, and that may very well be the case. However, it is important to acknowledge that eye contact does not have the same importance or significance in every culture in the world. So again, if we only pay attention to eye contact, we take the risk of missing many differences or subtleties and misdiagnosing or missing, not diagnosing someone who actually is autistic. So here again, some articles from the internet highlighting the importance of eye contact. And there's one that says, children with autism don't pay as much attention to people's eyes, and eye contact shows that you are paying attention. Okay, but not everywhere. Eye contact shows that you are interested in what someone has to say. That may be true in the US or in Europe, but not everywhere. Helps you understand how someone is feeling. Okay, but that is not true everywhere in the world. Allows you to figure out what someone is really trying to say. And that, again, the association of eye contact with being truthful and honest is a cultural construct and is not shared universally. So here, the assumption that eye contact has a certain signification cannot be applied everywhere, and it's important to be aware of it. Eye contact is not universally required in conversations. So for instance, in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, this can be considered as rude or defiant to maintain eye contact. And therefore, in those cultures, from a very young age, people will learn to never make eye contact. So what happens to autism in a society where eye contact is prohibited? Of course, there are still autistic people, but if we rely on that criteria and we do not acknowledge that this may not apply everywhere in the same way, then again, we have many blank spots in our perception and understanding of autism and autistic traits. So again, expression, the way we express attention and conversation varies across cultures, and it's important to acknowledge it. So now that we see how culture may have an impact on our understanding, or at least our perception of autistic traits, we need to talk about what is at the core of this, and that is the perception that is implied here, which is our own culture. And when I talk about our own culture, I include myself in it, and that is the Western culture. I consider myself as a Westerner, even though I have lived in non-Western societies. But here, I need to explain a little bit more what I mean by Western centrism, decolonization, but also whiteness, because whiteness is also an important term, especially when I talk about power dynamics between dominant groups and marginalized groups. And here in this context, whiteness is in a position of systemic advantage, and I need to define a little bit more what I mean by that. So whiteness are the societal structures of power which recognizes, validates, and centers white cultures, actions, bodies, and experiences at the expense of those of people of color. And here we have examples, for instance, the way that eye contact is considered as a form of respect and being truthful. This is precisely a product of whiteness, because it only validates and centers white cultures, and it fails to acknowledge that other cultures outside of that realm also exist. Same with interjection and showing attention by being silent. This is a product of a white culture, and that might be valid in white cultures, but not outside. But because of whiteness and the assumption that white is universal, we fail to recognize that. So whiteness is an identity that we don't know we have. Not me, even though I am influenced and I do share a part of whiteness as my identity, but because whiteness is considered as the default, as we've seen with, for instance, the autistic criteria, white cultures are considered as the default, we do not realize that they are not universal. So it is not an identity that we understand or that we are aware that we have. And whiteness is a lens that distorts how we see the world because of the position of hegemony that whiteness is in. But that also applies to all forms of systemic advantages. Heterosexuality, for instance, as a systemic advantage, also leads to the same blind spots, the same lack of awareness of that identity as an identity that defines the individual, and also as a lens that distorts how we see the world. So here I talk about whiteness, but the same applies to all forms of systemic advantages, identities. And now talking about Western centrism and decolonization. Decolonizing, here it's the curriculum in that quote, but that also applies to research, to science in general. Decolonizing begins with the proposition that academic knowledge, traditions have been profoundly shaped by a colonial past and present. And this is why I started with whiteness, because white as a dominant group that has colonized parts of the world has had a huge influence. So colonization has had a huge influence on how we perceive the other, how we perceive the world. And it is important to acknowledge that there is no such thing as neutral or universal or objective, because everything that is human is perceived through the lens of our culture, our traditions, our values. And those values, they don't come from nowhere, they come from our context and our position in society. So this is why it's so important to acknowledge it. And unfortunately, that is what they failed to do, for instance, with the autistic criteria. And decolonization is about decentering the hegemony of Euro-Western centric knowledge and knowledge production. So I did a little bit of that just before with the example of eye contact and conversation interjection. So again, it's not saying that one is more valid than the other, than the European, Western, or white way is better or worse than the other. It's simply acknowledging that there is a variety of ways of doing things, of being, of practicing, of communicating, of engaging, of expressing oneself. And it is important to be aware of it, because not acknowledging those differences can lead to marginalization, to discrimination, to a lower rate of diagnosis of autism amongst Black people. So all of that has consequences, including on autism as well. So what does it mean for autistic people of the global majority? Here, when I talk about global majority, I mean people of color. So people who exist outside of whiteness, who are a demographic majority, because white people are a minority. There are more people of color than white people in the world. However, whiteness has the systemic power. But so that's what I mean by global majority, that's people of color. People of color are more likely to fall through the cracks of identification and or diagnosis for the reasons that we've seen before, because with criteria that are completely molded and shaped by Western centrism and whiteness, people who fall outside of that realm are more likely to never even realize that who they are would fill the criteria for autism. And even if they do realize it, they are more likely to not be diagnosed as autistic, again, because their autism does not present the same way as it may present in Western cultures. People of color are less likely to understand and advocate for their needs, because they might not even know, they're more likely to not even realize that they're autistic or neurodivergent. They are facing specific barriers to accessing help and support that we've seen with the survey earlier. And the intersection of other marginalized identities with autism makes them more likely to be stereotyped and discriminated against. So if they are busier than other people trying to survive and to survive and fight against an oppressive system, they have less time to take care of their mental health, to even acknowledge the importance of it, and also take care of their identity and understand that their neurodivergence might be an identity as well. So this has an impact on people of color, people of the global majority, or anyone who happens to fall within a minority or marginalized identity. It doesn't have to be ethnic or racial. That applies to all forms of minority identities. So now that we know that the diagnostic criteria for autism has a cultural dimension that is ignored, unfortunately, and isn't purely based on how it affects the individual, this is what the diagnostic criteria claims to do. It's supposed to be only based on the experience and how the individual is affected by their impairments. But we see that it's actually based on culture a lot. So we need to ask ourselves, what even is a disorder and what has it got to do with colonization? So I'm going to give you 3 examples of disorders that are no longer considered as disorders. So we have hysteria, which is considered both common and chronic among women. And even though it was categorized as a disease, hysteria symptoms were synonymous with completely normal functioning female sexuality. In extreme cases, the women may have been forced to enter insane asylum or to have undergone surgical hysterectomy. So they were simply displaying completely normal symptoms given the context of whatever they were experiencing, but they were that was pathologized simply because they were women, and with all that was attached to that identity, that marginalized identity, they came up with a whole disorder, hysteria, that is just rooted in misogyny and sexism. Another example, and I don't know what's going on. I've lost my slides. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I don't know where that has gone. Let's try again. Okay, I don't know if that happened to you as well, or if it was just me. Okay, let's go back to it. Sharing my slide, and let's move to nymphomania. So I will start presentation again. And so nymphomania, another perfectly normal human behavior that was pathologized simply because of the assumptions and misunderstanding of a marginalized identity, which was again women in this case. So they were associated with madness, and what was considered as almost something positive for men, which was hypersexuality, was considered as a disease, a disorder for women. And that could go as far as simply having desire for a man that they were not married to. That was considered a pathology and a disorder. Again, we see that has nothing to do with medicine. It's not based on the experience of the person. It's simply completely rely on social norms at the time and who was in a position of deciding what was a disorder or not. And my favorite, Dropitomania, and it was a supposed mental illness that in 1851, Samuel Cartwright hypothesized as the cause of enslaved African fleeing captivity. So he couldn't figure out, he couldn't possibly understand why a slave would want to leave their captivity. So he made it a disorder because that it had to do with them being crazy, obviously. Slave life was so pleasant, the official view was, that only the mentally ill would want to run away. In actuality, the desire for freedom is a natural human impulse, in case we are not clear on that. So those 3 disorders have something in common. The white supremacist, racist, misogynist, and patriarchal implications of those disorders are a reflection of how members of a dominant group can perceive any divergence from their own behavior and mindset. So what is considered normal or disorderly is a function of power conferred by hegemony. So let's have a look at that power and how that applies, and how what is considered the norm is shaped by who has the power. The way that power applies and it exerts violence over people is epistemological violence. So epistemological violence refers to the interpretation of social scientific data on the other So the one who's not in a position of power but doesn't really have a say, and is produced when empirical data are interpreted as showing the inferiority or problematize the other, even when data allows for equally viable alternative interpretation. So here, again, that takes us back to what I defined as the colonial mindset. So what is different is assumed to be inferior or problematic because it's from the other. So here again, we have the kind of assumption that is violence, that causes a form of oppression because, well, if it's in the case of scientific data, for instance, those have consequences on our understanding of society and on people's lives. So that power, that's the hegemony. And this is what I've been talking about from the beginning, different hegemonies and people in position of systemic advantage. Those people are considered benefiting from a hegemony. So hegemonies are the dominance of certain social groups over others that result in universalism, blank spots, and sense of entitlement. So what I've been talking about so far, they are all manifestations of that universalism, or those blank spots. So the blank spots is the fact that we cannot be aware of how other people exist, how everybody else exists, especially if we are in a position of systemic advantage or privilege. Nothing in the system and in our society pushes us to think outside of our world because the world works for us. So we don't have to think about how it exists outside of it. So that gives us blank spots. And sense of entitlement is the assumption that we have access to all the knowledge, all the spaces, all the identities, they are the same as ours. And all of those, they're not necessarily the result of an intention of being dominant. Those are naturally occurring. If we are in a position of privilege, then we have blank spots. I am a cisgender man, therefore I have many blank spots on what is the experience of women or on trans people, because this is not my experience. And because of that position of privilege, I have less awareness of their existence, their lives, than they would of my existence, which is part of the norm. So quickly, a non-exhaustive table of hegemonies, because as I said at the beginning, my work aims to show how they all boil down to power dynamics between the hegemonic or dominant group and marginalized groups. So as hegemonies, I've listed whiteness, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, classism, ableism, patriarchy, and neurotypical normativity. So the neurotypical normativity is neurotypical people, so holistic, people who are not autistic and who are not who do not have ADHD, for instance. And here I'm again showing that the hegemonies are not necessarily the result of an intentional action, but it's simply because of the blank spots that that position gives us that may cause further marginalization or exclusion of people of the other. And so here is a quick table of how those hegemonies might manifest themselves. And so I would ask the question, how do we know that we're not doing the same with autism? How do we know that our perception of autism is not simply the product of the hegemony and the blank spots and the assumptions of universalism that I've talked about so far? I don't have the answer. But if you would look into it as researchers, for instance, because again, there is a lack of research that encompasses both the autistic identity and racial and cultural minorities. So we need to know more about that. And here we have the harms of the medical model. So again, perceiving autism through the lens of the deficit, of the failures, of what it doesn't do and how it diverges from the norm, knowing that the norm is cultural and depends on the society that it exists. It leads to dehumanization that denies basic respect and dignity, pathologization of neutral and positive differences, reductionism to a social disorder, despite complex traits and sensory motor underpinnings, and essentialisms, despite autism's fluid boundaries. And that can also even happen within, for instance, researchers that are autistic, but we can internalize biases that and end up in us, for instance, in engaging in epistemological violence. So I talked about whiteness, I talked about neurotypicality, and here what I posit is that the mechanisms of systemic advantage, they have the same consequences and the same results. So we've already seen what whiteness was, but I would posit that exactly the same can be applied to neurotypicality. So you remove whiteness and you change the word and everything else still works. Neurotypicality is the societal structure of power which recognizes, validates, and centers neurotypical mindset, action, bodies, and experiences at the expense of those of neurodivergent people. And this is something that autistic people experience all the time. Neurotypical as an identity we don't know we have. Neurotypical as a lens that distorts how we see the world. Again, what works for whiteness works for all forms of hegemony. Both identities are in a position of systemic advantage that makes them prone to exerting epistemological violence over the other. So now, the limitations of a deficit-based diagnosis of autism, as we've seen earlier with the snippets and some of the autistic traits of the diagnosis, a lot of it relies on the absence of deficiency or abnormal behavior. So all of that is deficit-based. It's not based on what autistic people can do better than the norm, but only on what they supposedly fail at or are deficient in. As you may have noticed, there are many crossovers between this webinar and the previous webinar from last month by Dr. Monique Botta. So I will, for the next few slides, I will be using examples that they found from their research and that are very useful for the point that I'm making. So the harmful, infantilizing, and dehumanizing misconceptions about autism and autistic people that we will see here and that will compare to the same kind of discourses applied to Black or Indigenous people, they are quotes that were compiled by Dr. Monique Botta and in their research that they presented at the last Crae webinar. And those discourses are unfortunately all too familiar to people of color. So here we have examples. The person with autism's difficulty is more profound, making the possibility of identifying with a community more daunting. While it is true that communities of persons exist, disabled or otherwise, it is not the case that a community of autistic people is prone to them. There is not, nor could there be a community of autistic people, since a failure of theory of mind would preclude being a part of any community. That was a claim made by a researcher. That's extremely harmful, negative, wrong, and it's not even supported by reality. A quick Google search shows you examples of autistic people getting together, forming community, sending letters to the United Nations, specifically to ask to be recognized as a minority identity. So it is simply disproven by facts and reality, but again, from a position of hegemony, with the blank spots and the assumptions of universalism, anything that diverges from our own perception is assumed to be inferior, and we end up with quotes like this. And to the Black person that I am, this is unfortunately very familiar because the same kind of discourses have been used, weaponized against African people, against Black people for centuries. Example here, they are apt to do mischief, which appears as if intentional, but is mostly owing to the stupidness of mind and insensibility of the nerves induced by the disease. So here, another example of pathologizing just the Black identity. They break, waste, and destroy everything they handle, abuse horses and cattle, tear, burn, or rend their own clothing, and paying no attention to the rights of property, steal others to replace what they have destroyed. So here, extremely harmful depiction of Black people and enslaved people. Obviously, absolutely not rooted in anything objective, but we see the similarities in those two discourses. I hope that by putting them side by side, we can realize how it seems that history is repeating itself, just with a different group. And so those are more quotes, more examples of stigmatization on one hand of autistic people, and other hand, Black people or indigenous people. So autistic being shut down from the outside world, rigid, emotional, fat, and we had equivalent kind of tropes, harmful tropes, for instance, represented by this sapphire caricature that portrays a Black woman as rude, loud, malicious, stubborn, and overbearing, violently and rhythmically rocking her head. She is a shrill magger with irrational states of anger and indignation, and is often mean-spirited and abusive. We have examples of objectifications without often comorbid disability, and dependent upon the severity of their autism, they are interesting, often charming, and valuable members of the community. How sweet. And equivalent for Black people, if his master or overseer be kind and gracious in his bearing towards him without condescension, that is quite funny, and protects him from abuses, the Negro is spellbound and cannot run away because he will be so well treated. So here we have this kind of condescending, infantilizing, and objectifying discourses that have been at a time applied to Black people, and that seem to just be now recycled to autism, and nobody's batting an eyelid, apparently. Dehumanization, autism people may demonstrate an apparent absence of empathy for people's feeling, lack of responsiveness, awareness of social cues or cultural norms. That's a classic one. Autistic are not aware, they don't understand, they can't grasp social cues. Instead of just seeing it as a difference, then we may have different social cues and different conventions, but that is perceived, again, because of the colonial mindset. What is different is perceived as absent or deficient. So memory, they are equal to the whites. In reasons, they are much inferior. And I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And in imagination, they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Again, the notion of norm. It has been used before. It is still being used without acknowledging who sets the norm. It would be unfair to follow them to Africa for this investigation. You don't have to, thank you very much. So different groups, same discourses, different times, same discourses that are just being recycled. But if you look at the way certain people talk about autism and certain researchers on autism, and if you just change the autistic identity and swap it for Black people, for instance, if it is racist applied to Black people, then what does that make it when it's said about autistic people? Clearly, there is a parallel here that is extremely dangerous. So this is why I'm talking about decolonizing autism and the benefits of it. And before I conclude this webinar, I need to acknowledge that some autistic people experience their autism as a disability, and that's valid. Here I've been advocating for the social model of disability, but that model does not take anything away from the lived experience and challenges faced by autistic people and their caretakers. Some people really struggle, and we have to acknowledge that. It focuses instead of understanding how society may have compounded those experiences, made them even worse, the experiences of disability, and how society could seek to accommodate it. So I'm not here trying to invalidate the experience of people who really do experience their autism as a disability, but I am focusing on what society does to it and how society adds a layer of difficulty and how it could remove that layer of difficulty to the autistic experience. So autism as a neurotype exists regardless of social context, regardless of culture. There is still autism in Japan. Just because eye contact is not the same as in the West, that doesn't mean that there are fewer autistic people, obviously. So it exists as a neurotype. And for instance, my research group, that's from Motran, and others believe that autism should be described and investigated as a variant within the human species. This variation in gene sequence and or expression may have adaptative or maladaptative consequences. So people really do struggle because of their autism, but they cannot be reduced to an error of nature that should be corrected. And I totally agree with that quote. That's why I've put it here. But autism as a disorder, as well as the stigma, misconception, and discrimination attached to it, are entirely socially constructed. And when applied to autism, decoloniality is a framework that can provide valuable tools to understand, analyze, and combat the mechanisms of marginalization of autistic people. So what are the benefits of decolonizing autism? They're not just for autistic people. And here I will stop sharing and I will try and talk directly to the camera. The benefits are not just for autistic people. But obviously they would be the main beneficiary of decolonizing autism, because it would provide better access to diagnosis, care, and support and accommodation for autistic people of ethnic minorities, because we've seen that they are already lacking and experiencing their autism in a much harsher way. And we see also that having a decolonial approach also includes the other ways that autism has been or is being perceived by other cultures that is not necessarily as stigmatizing as it is in the West. And we have the beautiful example of the Maori name for autism, which is Takiwatanga. I've learned that it was actually created recently by an autistic person, a Maori autistic person, and that means someone who's in their own time and space. So that is quite poetic and beautiful, and that is one of the benefits of having a look at how other cultures perceive the same realities and the same differences, the same traits and neurotype. And so that's for the autistic people, but now how that benefits society, I will share again, and I am finished soon, I promise. How it benefits society, besides the moral case, because obviously we should be more inclusive and decolonize because that's morally the right thing to do. But society also benefits from a more inclusive environment. And the hallmark of an enlightened society is its inclusion of non-dominant behaviors and phenotypes, such as homosexuality, ethnic differences, and disabilities. We should take the same step for autistics. Reducing stigma and discrimination of one identity always lays the ground to doing the same with other marginalized identities. And this is precisely what I'm trying to do when I approach the marginalization of people based on their race. I want to show as well the similarity in the dynamics of oppression that are applied to autistic people. So liberation from one form of oppression gives the tools to and leads to the liberation from another form of oppression. And we all benefit from it. There's this notion of covering that was posited by Kenji Yoshino, and it shows that even people, even white male, for instance, say that they do not feel like they can bring their authentic self at work. 45% of white males say that they don't feel comfortable bringing their authentic self at work. So that means that we live in a society where even the people who are the most privileged still do not feel like they can be themselves in certain situations. So a society that is more inclusive and that applies a lens that looks at how validates different ways of being, as accepts them as valid without stigma, is a society that we would all benefit from. And this is exactly what decolonizing purports to do. And that's the last slide. Decolonizing autism, what does that mean in practice? That is acknowledging that our understanding of autism is shaped by cultural and social norms that aren't universal. Acknowledging that the lived experience of autism is also shaped by cultural and social norms that aren't universal. Contextualizing the identification or diagnosis of autistic traits within the social and cultural context of the individual. understanding how the intersection of their multiple identities and marginalizations affects the experience of autism and poses unique challenges to each individual. If you deal with data, if you are researchers, which I hope there are many of you today, if you deal with data, analyze it using a diversity lens, for instance, ethnicity, because there is a lack of research on this. Engaging in autism research through juxtaposition of different autistic perspectives, intersectionality is a thing. Recognizing lived experience as a valid form of expertise. I do not have any degree and I am not a psych professional, but I hope that my lived experience as an autistic person and a Black person can be used as a form of expertise. And this is why I'm delivering this webinar today. Collaborating with autistic people of diverse identities, and compensating them for their labor. So this is what I would suggest decolonizing is. And I think I've gone way beyond the hour, but here we are.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joris, for such a brilliant talk. I think you've highlighted some huge issues within and beyond autism research. And I know from reading the chat that the talk has really resonated with so many people. There's been so many, brilliant discussions, and also many people thanking you for the excellent talk. We do have some questions that have come in, if you'd be happy to take a few. We've had a couple of questions who've come in about your point around diagnosis. So you mentioned how the criteria for autism is often based on cultural norms that might not apply in different contexts. One person's asked whether you think it would be useful to have different diagnostic criteria for different cultures, or whether you think diagnosis itself might just not even be valid.
I think that having different diagnostic criteria, not necessarily different, but make sure that what is established as diagnostic criteria takes into consideration the culture. So yes, it would be having a different diagnostic criteria. I am not against diagnosis because it gives access to help, to accommodation, to lots of things that autistic people need. So diagnosis is very important, but we also need to look at how some people might be excluded from it, and that is not. It doesn't seem to be the case at the moment, and there needs to be some research on that. But yes, so definitely trying to at least add the cultural dimension and acknowledging how the traits or they may manifest differently depending on not just the culture, but also, for instance, whether the person is a man or a woman or a non-binary person. Their autism will also show up differently because they would have been socialized differently. Society would have placed different expectations on them and would have different criteria of what is normal or abnormal behavior. Therefore, the autism will manifest itself differently. So it's not just having different criteria for different cultures. It's really having specific criteria that ensures that we take into consideration all of the identities of the person, especially if those are marginalized identities.
Absolutely. I think intersectionality is something that's been massively lacking in autism research and kind of clinical practice. We've had a really interesting question come in as well about your thoughts on the neurodiversity movement or paradigm and how you think it relates to the topic. And specifically, they've asked whether you think it's advantageous to change in perceptions of autism or whether that might still be based in whiteness.
No, I think that neurodiversity is the right way to go ahead, because it recognizes it as a valid identity that is not based on what we can't do, on what we are unable or what we're deficient in, but simply acknowledges autism as a valid way of existing, as a naturally occurring difference. So yes, I am absolutely in favor of neurodiversity. as long as you've said, we keep an intersectional lens. So we acknowledge that the neurodiversity also intersects with other identities that the person may have. So it will intersect with their whiteness if they're white. It will intersect with their minoritized identity if they're people of color. It will intersect with their gender identity, their social status, all of that. But as an extra layer of understanding someone's identity, yes, it's absolutely valid, and this is exactly what I advocate for.
Brilliant. We've had some questions come in that I think you may have answered in the final slides about ways that we can decolonize autism in research and also in everyday life. But there's another question that's come in about how do you feel about making the connection between neuromajorities and colonizers?
How do I feel? Well, I believe that's exactly what I tried to do in this webinar. So I don't know if I might have maybe some people may have felt like I was taking a leap or I was jumping from one point to another. But again, what they have in common is their position, the position of hegemony, and that does not imply that the hegemonic power is actively imposing and oppressing, but the mere structure makes it so that they will perceive the other through the lens of their own identity. But because it's a hegemonical position, they are less likely to be aware of it and to be aware that it is even a lens through which they perceive the world. So as a result, they just assume that everybody perceives the world the same way and everybody's experience is the same as theirs. And this is because of that we end up with those blank spots that fail to acknowledge that other cultures may do things differently, may perceive things differently. But again, it is not saying that white people are inherently, for instance, being ableist and excluding autistic people because of their whiteness, not their whiteness, but it's their position of hegemony and systemic advantage that unfortunately comes with the assumption of universalism, blank spots, and sense of entitlement.
Totally. And you mentioned ableism there, and someone spoke about actually internalized ableism and where you feel that falls within that. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Well, again, drawing parallels with different forms of oppression, there is such thing as internalized racism. I have internalized racism because I live in a racist society, so there is no way that it wouldn't influence my perception of things. And at the same rate, I have internalized ableism as well, because the norm in which I live is not the norm that I experience as a person. So that norm, that what is considered normal and abnormal, has inevitably influenced my perception of things. So the question is not that I cannot be ableist, I cannot be racist, because thinking that just doesn't help or address anything. What is important is to acknowledge that there are many ways in which I may be influenced and I may have internalized certain oppressive discourses, including ableism. So it is an everyday work to make sure that I identify the ways in which I am being influenced by society and deconstruct those implicit messages of society because they are oppressive. Yeah.
Thank
Some of that answers, but
no. I mean, we've had so much discussion going on, and we'd have you here all evening if we went through all the questions. But just to kind of finish off, I mean, there was so much that you spoke about, and I think what you really highlighted is that there's still so much work to do. And you spoke at the start about how, you know, you're not a researcher, but you hope there's lots here and that you'll inspire them to do research. If you could tell people, you know, if there was one key thing that you think is particularly important or one thing that researchers really need to do, what would you say that would be?
Well, I would say take an intersectional lens and also assume that everything everything that you do is from the perspective of has baked in blank spots and assumptions of universalism. If we start from that assumption, then you can work to try to debunk those, but know that they will come in your research. So account for it and try to organize yourself so that you can address it and identify it before it's too late.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think the first step really is being explicit about it, which doesn't always really happen, and kind of confronting that truth. And then the next step will be addressing it. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joris, for that really brilliant and thought-provoking talk and discussion. I just want to say as well, a big thank you to the Crae team for all of your support behind the scenes, and a big thank you to everyone who's joined. And I can see all the thank you messages coming into the chat as well. Please do take a look at our website, crae.ioe.ac.uk, for details of future webinars. And our next webinar is by Rebecca Wood on inclusion in school, learning the lessons from autistic pupils and teachers. And that's on Thursday, the 7th of April at 4 p.m. UK time. So we hope to see you there.